get the latest on the economy now. There was a big cabinet meeting yesterday involving government's economic cluster to discuss economic and social policy proposals, including helping the poor and the vulnerable. A lot's happened since we last heard from the economic cluster. Some analysts say government may be taking too long to introduce a stimulus package. In the middle of all of this is a conversation around where child care grants should actually be increased. We're joined now by our economics contributor, Newzroom Africa's economics contributor, Ayabonga Cawe. Ayabonga, good afternoon to you. Okay, firstly, we were expecting an announcement yesterday. Nothing came from it. There's been some form of economic stimulus. How would you rate our economic stimulus compared to what other countries have been doing?
Afternoon to you, Stephen, and afternoon to the viewers. I guess a lot of us, yes, were expecting some good news from the cabinet sitting yesterday. But we did get some clues about when we might hear about the broader economic package that the country's put together. If we just look at it from a fiscal perspective, Stephen, we've managed to make about publicly announced commitments of around 59 to 60 billion rand or so. Now, if you compare that to some of our BRICS comparators who are spending anywhere between 2 and 2.5% of GDP, we would probably have to ramp up that spending to around 80 billion rand or so, or I should say around just over 70 billion rand to be at comparable level. But I don't think that that's enough for a country that's the most unequal in the world. And you would probably want to get an intervention that is able to respond to that reality. So anything, say, between 10 to 15% of GDP, or 300 billion rand right up to half a trillion rand or so, is what I think is going to be needed for the fiscal intervention to support some of the lost wages, to ensure the survival of many entities, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, but also to extend relief to vulnerable households and to ensure some semblance of food security at a household level. So it's going to need a bit more than what we've put in at the moment, and we're probably going to need close on just shy of half a trillion rand in my view, for us to be able to really move the needle on some of these issues.
There's been a suggestion that there might be some sort of exceptional tax measures. We've seen some money coming through on the other side, but in terms of tax measures from the finance minister, what are you expecting?
Well, we can think of the tax measures from two perspectives, Stephen. There are some proposals around potential revenue-raising measures, which might mean the introduction of newer taxes to finance what is going to be a Herculean effort that's going to be needed here. On the other end, you can also think of tax as a relief to households and to firms. And I think on the firm side of things, we've seen through the Disaster Management Tax Relief and the Relief Administration Bill, provision for the expansion of the Youth Employment Tax Incentive. Now, you'd remember, Stephen, that incentive initially covered 18 to 29-year-olds and had been extended last year all the way through to 2029. Now, it's going to be expanded to everybody, irrespective of what age those workers would be, and for workers that are earning below 6,500 rand. The second part of the relief measures has also been the ability of some firms to defer their payroll tax obligations, so your pay-as-you-earn and some of your provisional income tax payments, which would be due at some point in the middle of the year, maybe towards the end of the year now. Some of those can be deferred without an obligation to pay any interest on that. And the idea behind all of those things is to free up some cash flow for some of the firms that are in distress. And what we've heard from the National Treasury is that if you combine the relief measures and the total cost of foregone tax revenue, that's about 15 billion rand or so that's been freed up and given back to firms to free up their cash flow position.
It's one thing to try and design policy and say this is what we want. It's another to actually make it happen. And I'm talking about, I suppose, the sort of practicality of something. So, for example, we might say the UIF fund is able to really help people. On the other side, I keep hearing stories of how difficult it is to actually access that money. How important, how big a problem is that? The practicability, in other words, actually getting it done.
I think this is a massive issue, Stephen, that's going to be put to the test now. I think all of us have pound seats now to this display of state capacity or the lack thereof. And it's certainly not a new or a novel issue in South Africa. Even the National Development Plan speaks about the importance of, ethical, capable and developmental state. And some of those issues really, I guess, go to the crosshairs of what is practically possible. Now, it's quite interesting, the Small Business Development Ministry was one of the first ministries to announce relief measures. And, a few weeks into the measure, there were some, teething problems that had to be troubleshot around the Biz portal and the portals online that are used to apply for the relief that is on offer. But if you extend that to probably where the biggest chunk of relief, at least of all for working people, is going to have to come from, which is the Unemployment Insurance Fund, and a surplus of around 30 billion rand or so that has been said to be on offer for this process. Since the start of this lockdown, there certainly hasn't been a lot of good news coming out of the Unemployment Insurance Fund about the ability of the process to be able to respond to the surge in demand and the surge in applications for some kind of relief in that process. I mean, we've been hearing stories over the last day or so of people saying, the system has been jammed up and locked up, which makes it difficult for employers and employees to be able to access that kind of relief. So those are the practical things. It's one thing at a high level, Stephen, as you say, to announce large figures of what you provided. It's something entirely different to ensure that the ICT, the information systems and the processes are in place to make sure that we get that money to households and to firms with the necessary speed and at the necessary scale.
Ayabonga, is there a much bigger conversation here around sentiment? And what I'm talking about specifically, say, with the childcare grant and increase in that, this is a country, in my view, in desperate need of good news. If we go back in history, say, to the Great Depression, the one thing that Roosevelt did at the time was to, the famous quote, I was talking about it with Kolani Mbandwe yesterday, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. In other words, the idea is people need a boost. How important is it to get some good news out of that cabinet meeting on Monday?
I think sentiment, Stephen, is critical, least of all on two very important dimensions. The first one is that the reality of the situation now is that we are going to have to borrow at a macro fiscal level, at a higher level than what we'd anticipated. And how does that, somebody might be asking themselves, how does that interface with confidence and sentiment? Well, at the end of the day, some of that money is going to be foreign savings. And the big issue is about how do you intervene to change the terms on which you're able to borrow long term. And a lot of that has to do, yes, with what you can do on the monetary side of things, to buy bonds in the secondary market to try and change those yields. I think that the other part is also about the credible communication of some of the things that you can do, where the opportunities are, but also a very credible communication of where the shortcomings are. A big chunk of what we're talking about here is about how do you intervene, give relief, give food parcels to people at a local level. And the reality is that this is a perfect opportunity to now create the capacity to not only deliver food parcels, but to deliver all of the other services that we haven't been able to deliver even prior to COVID. So confidence is important on that end, but also I think South Africans are yearning for good news. South Africans are yearning for some step change from some of the bad news and the dreary commentary that we've been hearing about this crisis, and even, I guess, the story of the numbers that continue to trudge along. And so there is some clamor and need from South African consumers and South Africans as an electorate that says, can you give us a credible, coordinated, and very aggregated plan of what it is that the government is going to do, for how long it's going to do it for, because this has to be temporary as well, so that you can reassure households, you can reassure the marketplace, you can reassure consumers, so that there isn't the kind of panic when we start to relax the lockdown that we saw when the national state of disaster was declared.
Ayabonga Cawe, as always, thanks so much. Economic contributor here at Newzroom Africa.